stood, imposing, striking fear into the inmates that were brought through the massive steel gates. Arizona State Penitentiary, with its armed guards watching over every move from the 12 towers that encircled the compound. My name is Jack Davidson, and for 30 years I was head warden on death row at the penitentiary. I look back on my time there with a great deal of pride and also sadness. What follows is a recollection of my final days within the prison walls. It was early in 1973 when I took the decision to leave the prison service. I had seen and been part of way too much death for my liking. Arizona State Police was the home to the worst of the worst. I tried to make the inmates feel less like the criminals they were by talking to them on a personal level, rather than barking out orders at them. But if I'm honest, I knew it didn't really help and most saw me as a soft touch. I did it because I was selfish and it made me feel good. My last few days were really ones of sadness, mainly due to the fact I had to oversee the execution of an inmate I had developed a special bond with. Garrett Johnson was a convicted killer. He had taken the lives of the Richards family in a robbery gone wrong. Firstly, he tied up the parents, not realizing the children were sleeping upstairs. He then proceeded to slit the woman's throat in order to get the location of the family safe. It was as the stifled screams died down that he noticed the 8-year-old daughter and 4-year-old son stood at the bottom of the stairs. He turned and ran up the stairs after them, stabbing them repeatedly until he was knelt in a pool of their young, innocent blood. After he returned downstairs, he found himself with no option but to slaughter the father too. He began to torture him first. In a sick and twisted way, he seemed to enjoy what he was about to carry out. He searched the garage only to find firstly a sledgehammer and a box full of 6-inch nails. He then explained to me in great detail how he enjoyed what came next, describing how he felt, excited and in a strange way aroused at the sound of the nail as it hit the bone of each of Mr. Richards' feet as it went through and secured them to the floor. Then the same searing pain was inflicted on his knees, hands, and elbows, before he broke all of his fingers and toes with the hammer, and finally he caved the back of Mr. Richards' skull in with a hammer, hitting him almost a dozen times. Garrett and I had become quite close by the time the date of his execution came through. It was the 17th of February, 1973. My heart sank a little as the news came through, and it was my duty to inform him. As I entered his cell, he stopped throwing his old baseball against the wall and just looked at me knowingly. "Well," he said. "The 17th of February, I replied. "That's cool. At least I know," he answered, emotionless. It was now the 16th, and I was shocked to hear his last request was to spend his last few hours with me. And with that, he confided in me details of his life before this one. At one point, he was an upstanding citizen with his own car sales lot. He had a wife, Mary Ann, and 2 daughters, Jamie, 4, and Ellen, who was 8 at the time of his incarceration. Mary Ann had visited on a few scarce occasions, but had never brought the children, and Garrett said he understood why, even though it hurt like hell. He went on to explain the circumstances which led to him being here on death row, why he committed the robbery in the first place, and how it went wrong. His life had hit rock bottom. Mary Ann was about to leave him. Ever since his business went down the pan, he turned to drinking and drugs. He owed money to dealers, a lot of money. Crime was the only way that he could see to get out of the trouble he was in. So off he went on a drink and drug-fueled mission to get $3,000 he owed, as he entered the house at 10189 East Avenue. He wasn't expecting to be welcomed by the family. After all, it was 2:30 a.m. The rain pounded down incessantly, beating on the windows with a dull but steady drone. He went on to say that he felt like he was in the house for hours, but in fact it was all over in 20 minutes. After emptying the family's safe, he just ran, and ran to nowhere in particular. He just had to get away from there before the reality set in. It was another 15 minutes before he was stopped by officers. panicking and covered from head to foot in blood. He confessed all he had done to the 2 patrolmen who were to escort him to the station. It was now 9:30 p.m., and as I stood to leave, Garrett looked up, smiled, and thanked me for giving up my time for him. I left him there with a slight feeling of sadness and also one of apprehension, as I knew the following day I would have to bear witness to his death. As the morning of the 17th came upon us, I made my way to cell 113 to collect Garrett with a slightly heavy heart. Yes, I believe the sentence was correct, but it didn't make this part of my job any easier. As we left his cell, a wry smile came across his weathered face, and he said to me, "Time to make my peace with God and the Richards family, if they'll let me." I stood straight and tried to keep my emotions in check, which was always hard for me to do on these occasions, and began to escort him from his cell. We slowly made our way down the wing, accompanied by Father Daniels, the prison pastor, to the execution chamber. The other inmates stood by their cell door, hanging their heads as we passed by. You could feel the tension as every one of them knew that the same fate awaited them, some sooner than others. As we turned left at the end of the corridor, the cold sweat that always took hold of me arrived. I could see the chamber door from here. I inhaled deeply and marched forward. Inside the chamber sat the most horrific contraption I had ever seen, the grotesquely constructed electric chair. The shaved-headed Garrett calmly sat down whilst the metal cap and face cover were placed on his head and his arms and legs were securely strapped into place. When asked if he had any last words, he said, "I'm sorry. Please forgive me." And with that, the curtains were drawn to separate the spectators gathered in the witness room. As the switch was thrown, the lights dimmed for a split second, and he was gone. The local mayor, the last few remaining members of the Richards family members, and a small gathering of local journalists had arrived to watch the man die. 3 days later, I left the prison for the final time, even more haunted by the things I had seen and been a part of. The inmates that died were more like my friends than anything else, and I was struggling to come to terms with what I would do next. My first thought was my wife. I would talk to her. The only problem was she passed away in 1970. But that didn't stop me from talking to her. She still gave me sound advice. So there I sat, chatting away with my dear Doris, with a bourbon in one hand and a Cuban cigar in the other, asking her how to deal with the sorrow I had inside me. Her answer was simple. Meditation was the answer she came up with. "Find the peace inside yourself," she said, and then she was gone again. The weeks passed and I began to feel better about myself. How long it would last is another question. As the time passed me by, I felt an increasingly strong sensation deep within my senses. A feeling of constantly being watched and followed, and a nervousness dwelled in the pit of my stomach. It was several days later when things started to take a turn for the worse, and I began to see images of the many I had put to death in the execution chamber. Ironically, the first to appear was Garrett. There he was, with an all-too-familiar grin across his face. Gray eyes narrowed as he stared at me with his thinning gray hair swept to one side. His orange coverall scorched around the wrists and ankles. And that is when my torment began. Now Garrett is the one I thought I wouldn't have any repercussions from. But as it turns out, he was probably the worst. It started with the little practical jokes, like moving things when I wasn't looking. But over the course of a week, things started to become more sinister. The first hint I got that Garrett was looking for something more than his little jokes when I was watching the TV one evening. Suddenly across the room, a picture of my late wife, who passed in 1970, hurtled through the air at great speed, smashing through the screen of the set. I just froze where I was, unsure of how to react. I heard a familiar giggle from the other side of the room. "Garrett?" I asked. "Well, who else are you expecting, Jack?" You stood and watched them take our lives away from us, and now we're gonna take yours. We? Who's we? I quizzed him. Me and the boys from the block, he replied. Just then I staggered backwards towards the sofa as I looked upon the faces of the multiple bodies I had seen put to death, and they all seemed to blame me, like I could have done anything to stop their death. Throughout the years I was employed at the prison. All I wanted to do was to help them take their focus off of the inevitable. It was then I realized that all I had done was succeed in giving them an easy way to get back at me for allowing them to die. Of course, I didn't allow them to die. I was just carrying out my duties. However, they didn't see it that way and wanted their revenge. It was after this that my mental health deteriorated. Insomnia settled in, creating acute paranoia. And so it was. My life had become a medication-fueled sub-existence from what it once was, tormented by the fallen souls I had helped to create, and it was becoming harder to deal with by the day. Each day was different. There was even days when they would leave me alone, but by this time there were at least 20 or 30 of these spiritual tormentors against me. I made the life-changing decision to sell up and move myself into a secure facility, where I believed they could help me and look after me, ensure that my medication was administered correctly. I made the decision after the series of attacks that Garrett and the other spirits had subjected me to over a period of 2 days. I firmly believed that their aim was to force me into taking my own life, but I was stronger than that. And even though they put me through a living hell, I was a fighter. Everyone knew that, and I wasn't going to give in. The attacks came thick and fast over the following 3 weeks, as every time they appeared, they forced themselves through my body. I could feel the burning deep inside me. They all laughed, whilst they inflicted this indescribable pain upon me. All the while, their eyes glowed with evil enjoyment. It was like somehow I was on fire from the inside, but only for short 20-second time frames. My heartbeat increased and my blood seemed to boil as I doubled over in pain. This was to continue throughout every night that followed. Things seemed to have settled down somewhat after I came here. But please understand, although they don't appear as frequently, when they do, they are more savage than ever before. They now get inside my head, causing me to relive the pain they suffered as the electricity hit their brains. My life slowly being drained from me, or at least that's how it felt. I know now that I won't be long of this world, and that once I do pass over to the other side, their torment will be relentless. But for now, I'll keep fighting.